I'm excited to dive right into the deep end of the pool with you. So we're going to focus on K12 education first. And I am making you superintendent of a random school district with 20 schools, middle and high school, let's say. Let's leave out K5 for now. And you want to build an AI strategy for that district. How do you, as someone who's pretty knowledgeable about AI, think about going about creating an AI strategy and policy for a school district?
Good question. And, I'm going to first caveat this by saying that I am not an education expert. I do know a lot about AI, but, hopefully I can ground these things in things that folks that are experts in education will find attractive. So, I think the first thing is just to accept the fact that this is not something where I would say you want to just come up with a perfect plan and then just implement. AI is advancing at a really rapid clip, trying to predict the future, even for those of us that are in the AI space, is almost impossible. It's very difficult to know what's going to happen 10 years from now, forget about, or even a month from now, forget about like 10 years from now. So I think the first thing I'd say is to really focus on not big transformational one-time things, but more of what are the things you can do kind of each day to build AI into the existing curricula and into the lesson plans that you're already using, and having that be the avenue through which you introduce AI. So not having it, for example, be a new class or a completely new way of teaching, saying, what do you already have and how do you begin to incorporate AI into that? So, an example would be, you mentioned, middle school or high school. Well, there's a lot of interesting research, for example, written at a collegiate level that could be really interesting to middle schoolers and high schoolers, but where it's not written for them. It's not entertaining. It's not their reading level. AI is really good at making those things accessible. And so you could, for example, upload a paper to Claude 2 or GPT-4, one of these models, and let the students talk to it and ask it questions and learn from that research, even though the research was never actually used, written for them. So, those are examples where I think you can weave it in. And then I think at a more system level, it's about saying, as you're weaving those things in, how are you providing access to the models, the hardware, the tools that teachers are going to need in order to adopt AI? So not focusing on what they're doing with it, but just making sure they have access to it and they have ways of introducing into their classrooms, and then reinforcing those things that are working and really doubling down on them. So when you see practices that are working, really promoting those. When you have opportunities, for example, to send educators to conferences and things like that, do that and really lean into the fact that you get them in the flow, and it stops to become this big, intimidating, monumental thing you have to challenge that you have to take on, and it becomes just something that you think about every day and make small progress and small steps on every day.
It sounds like you're saying have a ground up strategy, which is what I'm seeing with some of the schools I'm working with, that there's just some teachers who are ahead of the curve and are implementing and innovating and doing some cool stuff. And so it seems like you're saying also just empower those folks and try to get them to share their practice. Is that kind of what I'm hearing?
Yeah. And I also think the other thing is, but I think it's a little bit less passive. I think that just waiting for 1,000 flowers to bloom and hoping for the best, I'm not sure will lead to the outcomes, especially in the timeline that you're going to need. So I do think there also needs to be a reframing of what the real risk is. There are certainly risks to adopting AI. I actually think the risks of not adopting AI are much, much greater. And so I think it's also a reframing of what is the potential risk of AI, and just putting a little bit more emphasis on the direction you want is innovation, and really making sure that you're pushing in a direction that's forward, as opposed to just passively waiting for things to happen.
I think we can't, you said something pretty provocative there, so we got to drill down deeper there. The risks of not integrating AI are greater than the risks of banning it or not allowing it. Give me your mental calculation there.
Yeah. So there are two ways that I think about this. So one is that students that are in school right now, they're going to enter a labor market at some time in the future that is going to increasingly look very different than the labor market has historically. Historically, what you've had, we have close to 4 billion people in the world who are working, have jobs. Like, we run all of society on human labor. And even though it seems like we have a lot of technology today, on a relative basis, most of what we do is still, for the most part, manual or has a very large kind of human labor component. Over time, the question I ask, I actually talk about this in my book: what does an economy look like that has 100 billion machines and 4 billion human workers? That looks very different than the world where we live today. And if you're unable to participate in that workforce in a way that really takes advantage of all that digital labor, machine labor, artificial intelligence, whatever term you want to put to it, if you can't take advantage of that, it puts you at a severe disadvantage. So I think, one is just making sure that students are prepared for the workforce that they're going to be entering in the future and how that looks different. I think the second big thing for me is there's some interesting research in the private sector about what introducing AI actually does in a group setting. And what you see is that it doesn't tend to enhance the performance of your existing top performers in private sector. This was done in call center. This was done in a consulting firm. What it does, though, is it significantly boosts the performance of people that are struggling most. And so I think if we're going to have a conversation about closing the achievement gap, both within schools and within districts, but also across districts, I think AI is one of the few things I've seen that offers a lot of promise for being able to do that effectively if what we're seeing in the private sector translates to the social sector.
Just anecdotally, I see second language learners who struggle with writing using Chat GPT to proofread their work or help them get started on an outline, and it's an amazing boost for them. What are your recommendations for the nitty gritty here? Is when is it appropriate for a student or a teacher? Let's use English class for a writing assignment. I know you're not an educator, but what would you think would be the right parameters for an English teacher to set on a research paper, for example?
Yeah, so this is where it becomes a little bit more difficult for me, just because I don't necessarily have a background in the learning process and psychology of and the neuroscience of how children learn over time. But I my view on that is I think providing access to the tools, I think at a base level, that overall is just a good thing, mainly because, to what I just said, it tends to benefit the students that are struggling most, and
Mhm.
it doesn't necessarily lead to sharp drop-offs in the students that are performing. Now, the question is, at some point, does introducing the technologies too early circumvent the learning process such that the students don't learn the core concepts? So you mentioned about like writing a report. Well, if I don't learn how to do research, if I don't learn how to fact check, if I don't learn how to synthesize, if I don't learn how to produce new and novel insights, well, if I don't learn how to do those things and it's just the machine doing it, how, am I going to be at a disadvantage at some point in the future? And so that's the part that I think is a little unknown. I think the way that I would likely handle it is to really think about give the students access to the tools, but then modify a little bit how you interpret their and grade or evaluate the results. So evaluating on the basis of uniqueness and evaluating on things that frankly the AI is not very good at. I think some of those things can give you the opportunity to still reward those students that do have the ability to go above and beyond what the AI is able to do. But at the same time, you're able to kind of be able to reward the students that are really trying hard, but for whatever reason, either start out behind, have some other thing going on in their life that makes it so that they can't do the things at the same level. It at least puts them on a trajectory to be able to have skills that when they graduate are going to be valuable and help them earn a really decent living and not feel like they're just constantly behind and never able to catch up.
Yeah, I'm excited for our AI summit in March because we will have a lot of English teachers who've been experimenting, and this to me feels a little bit like the trial and error. We had to integrate the internet and Google and all these other tools into our educational process and have figured it out. but it's taken some time, right? And we're still trying to figure out if kids should have phones in school. That's still a very hot button issue. Um, one question I wanted to throw your way is, and this is a little bit more the domain of educational activists, is a lot of us have been sort of working to transform the educational system from a mid 20th century or even early 20th century educational model to a 21st century educational model with different types of assessments, more student-centered learning, more interactivity, more whole child approaches, and not the factory model of education. It almost feels with AI that we need to go from mid 20th century to mid 21st century and start to really think. We need to shed those habits fast and really think farther ahead about where, as you said, 100 billion AI machine learning tools with 4 billion workers. How, if I know you're not an education person, but you've worked with companies around the world. And in the end, we're trying to develop good citizens and good workers who can sustain themselves. How would you develop a school system that could train for the jobs of 2030, 2040, and 2050?
Yeah. So I think there are a few things that if I just look at what's happening right now in corporations and work my way back to the nature of the skill sets, there's a few common themes that I think start to emerge. So one is this idea of multidisciplinary learning and being able to tie together concepts across multiple domains. That increasingly is becoming more and more valuable. If you look at how many of the educational paths historically have evolved, they've evolved on the basis of specialization. And the longer that you stay in school, then the longer that, say, you go ultimately to get your PhD. When you do your PhD, ultimately you are at the kind of pinnacle of specialization. You are the deepest person in whatever your specific area of study is at that time. And what I'm seeing, at least in the private sector, is each individual narrow aspect of any domain is where the machines are gaining a lot of ground, where today there's a gap is being able to kind of string those things together. So if I think about how do you tie together artificial intelligence, neuroscience, psychology, sociology, economics, those are disciplines that in large part have kind of grown up somewhat independently without a lot of kind of pollination across them, but they're all somewhat related to how people make decisions and how people think and how you blend those together. So I think first thing is that multidisciplinary learning and starting to merge some of these things so that they're not individual paths. It is a much more kind of integrated path, especially as you stay in the system longer. I think, that's one thing that's important, not having it narrow the longer that you stay in the system. I think the second thing is, and this is one that I'm sure other people will disagree with this, but I do think we just have a gap right now in the languages that we're teaching students. And what I mean by languages is, in a world that's powered by human labor, being able to speak multiple human languages is a massive asset. It lets you access knowledge and culture and things that you wouldn't be able to access in the same ways if you weren't able to speak that language and if you weren't able to work with people that speak that language. I think over time, that same thing is also true of machines. If you don't speak machine language, if you can't do some basic programming, some basic coding, ultimately you end up being a consumer of AI, but not necessarily a creator and builder and somebody that can take those 100 billion machine workers and have them support you in your own career and be able to earn a living off of not just your work, but also the work of the machines that are supporting you. And so I think that language piece is another big piece. In addition, kind of the range is a piece that I would really focus in on heavily.
Oh, interesting. I'm not a techie, so but I am really good at searching Google for things.
Yeah.
I've never learned to code. In some ways, I slightly disagree with what you're saying because I'm already using an LMS ChatGPT pretty heavily in my consulting, and I think people who are not using LLM, I said LMS, LLMs, right? Large language models, uh, are really going to fall behind productivity wise with people they're competing with. But I don't think I need to learn how to code, or need to know too much about what's behind that LLM. But you're saying I should.
Yeah, and the differentiation I would say there is right now what you're able to do is consume the products that others have built, and you're able to benefit from them. You're able to make use of them in your job. The challenge is that those products are available to everybody, and over time, yes, there's going to be adoption delays, and you are an early adopter relative to maybe some other people, but ultimately, these are adoption S curves, and they do start to flatten out over time. Just like today, having access to a calculator isn't really an advantage relative to everybody else. But the people that adopted calculators first probably did have a big advantage relative to others. So, I think I think about that as consuming the products that others build. The difference here that I'm saying is building your own things. So you have a problem that you want to solve, and can you stitch together multiple machines to solve that problem? A really trivial example is I mentioned the research paper one, and this was a big problem of mine. I want to keep up on AI research, but there's dozens of papers produced every single day, and I can't read 30 pages, 30-page paper, 10 times a day and do it every day and do anything else with my life. So with some fairly basic programming and help from ChatGPT, I could write code that takes those research papers, puts them into entertaining podcast transcripts, and then pushes that to a podcast feed that I can listen to on my commute. It is not a lot of lines of code. It's a couple hundred lines of code. ChatGPT did the first pass of a lot of it, but I need to know, how do I link together what ChatGPT gives me? How do I host it on a server? How do I integrate it with the SQL database to house the episodes? How do I integrate it with the podcast hosting site? Like, those are things where I am a terrible programmer by any IT person standards, but having some proficiency in computer language allows me to make my own stuff that then has value and puts me in a position to capitalize on that.
Oh, that's super cool. What's the name of that website? Can we all access it?
Yeah, it's called Paper to Podcast.
Paper to Podcast.
Yeah.
I'm going to put that up on the screen so that people see it. So you're saying that there's a whole nother level of uh, literacy when if you can see behind and know some code. Give me the last part of this segment is define for me what an AI literate 18-year-old, I'm just saying senior in high school, would look like in your mind. What would you like for your own child to have at age 18 in terms of
Yeah.
AI literacy?
Yeah. So I have a 19-year-old and a 15-year-old. So this hits home. Um, so there's a few things. I think, number one is just having general awareness of what the tools are and what's available out there. You'd be hard pressed to find anybody that hasn't heard of Chat GPT, but then you start going down the list, and if I start throwing out things like, Claude 2, 11 Labs, these types of companies that build other AI tools, those are things that are accessible. They're not very expensive, or in many cases they're free. And so first thing is just an awareness of what the landscape is, what the tools do, what they're good at, what they're not good at. That's kind of first thing. Second thing is, I think I mentioned the language piece, so I'm not going to kind of come back to that, but having some proficiency in a computer language, frankly, doesn't matter what it is. All the languages build on each other, but some proficiency in a language that machines speak. And, just like whether you take Spanish, you take French, or you take, Mandarin, it doesn't matter what language you study. Learning a language human language is valuable. Learning a machine language is valuable. So that's the second thing. And then, the third thing I'd say is, a focus less on being the best and more on being the only. And that's something that I think is really important, is that, look, part of the one implication of AI is you're just not going to be able to outrun the machines and outcompete them in a very narrow area. It's just it's just going to be really hard. And I think we've become too obsessed with being the best in our field or the best person in this thing. And frankly, it's going to be really demoralizing if what you're trying to do is be the best in a very narrow area. It's going to constantly feel like you're fending off the machines. I think the question is, what's unique about you? What are you the only person that's capable of doing? I think finding that in yourself, and at least having an idea when you get to 18, you don't have to have that question answered, but having a sense of what's unique to you and how can you